We were to move out that very night, September 7-8. No time to pack. However, for the last few days the regiment was always on the move, so there was no need to pack a suitcase. And what kind of luggage do partisans have? Weapons and a duffel bag, which everyone tried to fill mostly with ammunition, and its weight was the same for both the rank and file and the commanders. I remember we had to part with our horses. In the upcoming raid they could become a hindrance, and I ordered to destroy them so that the enemy would not get them. It hurts, but what can you do? In order to somehow strengthen the exsanguinated regiment, Vasilev gave us a detachment of D.V.K. Kudyakov, which was part of the 3rd Brigade, but torn from it by the fighting for the edge. This detachment was the largest in the regiment: Sadov's detachment, Kudyakov's detachment, Zhuravlev's detachment, and the headquarters unit. At the moment of leaving the edge, we were 392 men in total. We passed for the rest of the night the forest camp of the inhabitants of the village of Guerilla and went deep into the deep forest massif. At dawn, we settled down for rest. We had to reorganize again, march at night and sleep during, but it was not new. The glow of numerous fires was blazing over the edge. We walked in places familiar to the smallest details, where every bush, every path was known and seemed to be native, where there was no need to look at the compass and map, and we were convinced that everywhere, even in smallest villages, the enemy had settled. The Punishers encircled the units of the 2nd Partisan Brigade, which was still resisting. We were not allowed to clash with the enemy, so we moved with extreme caution, trying to find the area where we could get out of the ring without bloodshed. We decided to cross the railroad at the section Chikachevo, Dino, almost close to Detovici, calculating that here, because of the proximity of a large garrison, enemy ambushes were least likely. It must be said that the occupants, having experienced the destructive power of our method of organizing the battle, ambushes, also adopted it. We had to be doubly careful. We managed to cross the railroad and the river Sodoma unnoticed, without adventures, though in anxious expectation, but quietly passed the day at the village of Shubino. Here I made a decision to move on by detachment. No, I have not forgotten. Of course, the sad experience of the summer of 1941 and the fate of Petrov's regiment. But it was not our misfortune then that we went to Lutty Bogs in battalions. We were inexperienced, we did not know the situation, and what to say, we were just becoming partisans. Now we were completely different. And such a maneuver for the regiment did not represent the former danger. Assigning the place of assembly forest area near the farm garage, I ordered the commanders of detachments to lead units developed by the headquarters routes. In the headquarters unit, which included sabotage groups, there were 56 of us. We also moved separately. We passed the Gramuli forests, unforgettably beautiful places of the Sodomskaya upland. Now we were walking along roads through villages, knowing that Hitlerites are rare guests here, but nevertheless we had reconnaissance ahead of us. On the way we were also engaged in preparation of products, which were willingly supplied to us by the population. It was always done in an organized way. The village headman was given a task to collect a certain amount of meat, milk, bread, and other products on account of state supplies. When this task was fulfilled, the headman received a receipt, which he had to present later, when the Nazis would be expelled from our land to the Soviet authorities. It must be said that among the headmen there were often very decent people. The villagers, nominating them, strove to have a good and reliable person in power. They persuaded such a person, explained that not for the service of the enemy, but for the benefit of the villagers he should take on this cross. And the man became a headman, a figure which today many are ready to indiscriminately consider shameful, but was in fact far from always so. Life is more complicated than any molds of it, and one should never judge hastily. Whether it is about the heroic or the mundane, the sublime or the lowly, hasty judgments give birth to nothing but a dead scheme. One should have seen with what joy these receipts of ours were taken, how carefully they were hidden, how carefully they were kept. After all, they were not a naive game, not a formality, and certainly not cynicism. Say, give me the meat and take this piece of paper for yourself. The guerrilla commander was a representative of the Soviet power. He ordered in its name, and since the time would come when he would transfer his authority to other people, peaceful people, a receipt was left, a manifestation of our unshakable confidence in victory, which was also transmitted to the villagers with these pieces of paper with our signatures. On the basis of receipts you can trace the route of a partisan unit, determine its approximate number. There was some risk, of course, but I repeat, The words headman and traitor are not synonyms. Besides, if the headman could really be dangerous for us, the villagers, as a rule, warned us about it. One of the villages where we procured food on our way to Karashach was Krasuka, a very beautiful wee. That's probably why it was called that. No one could have known then that it would be included in the list of bloody victims of Hitlerism, becoming an eternal monument to the people's grief. The occupants would burn it to the ground together with all the inhabitants, women, children, helpless old men and women. 280 people will die in the fire, for the fact that not far from the village will be blown up on a mine German car. The gathering of detachments at Harwich took place exactly on the scheduled date and without any accidents. It was September 13, and until the 14th we stayed in place, resting. It must be said that despite the only task of the regiment, which was to go to a new area, we continued at this time to strike at the enemy. This was done by our sabotage groups. For example, on the night of September 9-10, Koryukin's group on the Dino-no-Kanye railroad section let an enemy train between Klukino and Rogalivo fall off, destroying a locomotive and 8 cars. Same group on the highway Dervichi. Yaski destroyed 3 cars and 16 Hitlerites. Balabanenko's group also acted on the same section of the railroad, having blown up on September 10th a train car. From Karish it was not far to the final goal of our way. Having crossed the railroad Skov Porkov WTO, we came to the forests and swamps to the west of Porkov and in the area of the village of Lezenitsa, the place determined by Vasilev's order. On September 14 we began the march to the railroad. We went without waiting for darkness at 6 o'clock in the evening, and quite unexpectedly we ran into an enemy ambush. Fortunately for us, it was organized illiterally, either because of lack of experience or for other reasons I do not know. The attackers started too early. They opened fire when only our head guard had entered the ambush zone, and so they themselves soon came under heavy flank fire, first from the side guard and then from our other units. The fight ended quickly and much more favorably for us than it could have. However, we had wounded, and this made the transition difficult. However, there were not many of them. I remember that after the fight I'm some guy on the road, tall, broad-shouldered, energetic, cheerful, confident. It was obvious from everything that he had just come from the battle. He was still hot, not yet freed from the remnants of nervous and physical take, but satisfied. He walked briskly and seemed to regret that the skirmish had been so short. It seemed to me that I had seen this man before, but in some other environment, and I couldn't remember which one. I called out to him, and when he came up, I recognized him. Was it really Mikhailov? Yes, Comrade Commander Partisan Mikhailov, he reported cheerfully. I looked at him and involuntarily smiled. It was not surprising that I did not immediately recognize him. I could safely say that I now knew 2 Mikhailovs, the one who stood before me now and the other whom I had met in the spring during the fighting against the second punitive expedition. I noted to myself with great pleasure that there was nothing left of that Mikhailov now. That was the He came to the regiment together with the replenishment, which we took in the spring of 1942. And in the first battle he went missing in action. It didn't happen often, but it wasn't that rare. That's why, and mainly also because the guy stayed with us for a short time, he was quickly forgotten. But this story had a continuation, and quite dramatic. A few days later at the regimental headquarters appeared an old man of poor appearance, small in stature, puny, obviously not shining health and very excited. But he was trying to keep himself in good health. His chest was decorated with 2 St. George's crosses, a sign of his former valor and glory, as if he wanted to say that once he was quite different from what he is now, he had also fought for the motherland and was no worse than we are now, maybe even better. He spoke to me the way 2 military men who understand each other from half a word speak to a stranger, a civilian, and a civilian is better to be quiet, to listen, to gain wisdom. The outsider in this conversation was the very partisan Mikhailov. The old man had brought him with him, and the tragedy of the situation was that stood before me father and son, and by all the laws in force at the time I had to order the arrest and execution of the son. The fact is that Mikhailov escaped from the battle. Fighting is the least similar to the game, which is played in the yard boys. It is merciless, it is cruel, it is terrible, and it does not matter whether it is your first fight or the 100th. Well, I know that it's been said before me, but still, I always repeat on occasion. There are no people who are not afraid of death. Everyone is afraid, both cowards and heroes. It is not even known, by the way, who is more. After all, a battle is always a mortal danger, and human nature is such that in moments of risk to life it necessarily clicks some button on the remote control inside each of us, including the instinct of self-preservation. This is the strongest of instincts, and no one can disregard it. Nature has provided for its complete fails. The hero in this regard differs from the coward only, in that he directs his fear in the direction where this feeling is not able to grow to infinite limits and swallow a person entirely. The hero enters into a battle with fear and wins. Do not think, of course, that this fight lasts for hours. It happens that it takes only a moment to overcome weakness, but this does not mean that there was no fear at all. In other words, every fight always includes two fights, one with the enemy, the other with one's. But it can also happen that the two fights do not work out, that fear immediately wins, paralyzes the will, suppresses everything, and a person experiences then something like insanity. He cannot control himself. He does not remember himself. A boy, yesterday's schoolboy, Mikhailov, got into his first battle and ran from it. He did not remember how he found himself somewhere far away, unarmed, in some deep swamp. And when he came to his senses, the gunfight was no longer heard, and he realized that the irreparable had happened. He had chickened out, left his comrades in danger, and there was no forgiveness for him now. Do you remember Tolstoy's description of the battle in which Nikolenko Rostov flees, having chickened out from the French grenadier? After all, how understandable everything that happened to him then. Do you know what would have happened if all this had happened not in 1805 at Schengraben, but in 1942 near Leningrad? Rostov would have been shot, and not because they had not read War and Peace, and therefore would not have understood this man, but because cowardice in that battle, which we fought, was a crime that can have no excuse. But did the old man know this, who, when he saw his deserter son at home, was capable of only this: to hang his old battle honours on his breast, to take his son, pathetic in his confusion, and in his fear, by the hand to lead him to the regiment, and to say, "Judge the coward," and more severely? No, this the old man did not know. He knew that his son would be punished. You should have seen what became of him when he realized everything. And one could not help but admire this man, seeing how, clenched by terrible heartache, he held himself together and did not beg for mercy for his son, not pleading with words, not pleading with a look, not pleading with a gesture. But he was himself. No, we couldn't put Mikhailov against the wall. He was the exception. Did it justify itself? The answer stood before me on the forest road near the farm Karish. In the harsh school of war, boys became men surprisingly quickly, not at 25, not at 20, not at 18. The poet Yuri Voronov wrote about it like, "In the blockade days we never learned. Between youth and childhood, where is the line? In 43rd we were given medals, and in 45th only passports." Let the young people reading this book not take this as a reproach. Military adulthood is adulthood at a high price, and I do not wish such a thing to anyone. But for a boy to know when it is time to become a man, it is necessary that he is not looking for absolute numbers. If time demands, you need to be ready, and at 15 and earlier. We crossed the railroad successfully. We went deeper into the forests and swamps, but soon we were convinced that to be in this area meant continuous fighting with the Punishers, which even here we met almost at every step. The very next day after the skirmish at Karish, on September 15, we were again ambushed near the village of Rasadniki. Hitlerites who attacked us were dispersed, having suffered insignificant losses. On September 16, a battle in the area of the village of Lesnica. On September 17, a battle in the area of the village of Bogovo, and then throughout the day periodic skirmishes with the pursuing enemy. It became clear that we could not get a foothold. The area was completely controlled by the Punishers. Remembering Vasilev's order for this case, I decided to move north, to the places where the 3rd Brigade had gone. In order to break away from the pursuit, we left a cover in the Bogov area, Sedov's detachment. The rest of the detachments, having crossed at night a vast swamp and a rather large forest massif, came to the highway Piskov, Soltsy, Shimsk. Further our way lay to the forests to the south of Struga Krasnik. But in the area of the highway the irreparable thing almost happened. Traversing the highway, we could not, of course, refrain from the simplest diversion, violation of telegraph-telephone communication. In the rapidly advancing dawn, our men fell down telegraph poles on a fairly significant area, cut the wires, dragged dozens of meters of cable of the communication line into the forest. Frankly speaking, we ourselves did not suspect where we had struck and what kind of response we should expect. That is why our further actions can now be regarded as careless. We went a little deeper into the forest and camped for the day. We did not think, of course, that Hitlerites would not repair the destroyed communication line. They would. A little later I learned that we had broken the connection of the headquarters of Army Group North with the front. This, of course, could not go unpunished. I don't remember now exactly, but I think it was not even an hour after the regiment had settled down for rest, when from the direction of Pskov on the highway we heard the noise of engines, which at first increased and then subsided, just in the place where the sabotage had been made. And no sooner had we raised the men than a barrage of fire fell upon the regiment. The raid was so swift and heavy, and we were so unprepared for battle that the fate of the regiment seemed to hang in the balance. The men, awakened by the shots, not yet realizing what was happening, rushed deep into the forest, dragging with them those who tried to answer the enemy with fire. The detachments became unmanageable. The regiment fled. The name for it is panic. To judge about such a thing, it is clearly not enough, of course, even the most vivid descriptions. It is terrible mass of horror that covers people at such moments. It is terrible own helplessness. It is terrible consciousness of shame of what is happening. And another thing, giving in to panic, a person rarely acts rationally. More often he only worsens his situation, and to the very last extreme. What could have been done? Nothing, but to run away with everyone else. So I ran. Next to me ran the commissar and the chief of staff. Only we were not in front, but behind everyone. And I also had time to look sometimes at the compass. Funny, of course, but the commander should imagine where in the end he would be carried away by the fleeing fighters who did not understand anything. All this did not last long, just a few minutes, but they seemed very long to me. Finally, noticing that some of the fleeing fighters were gradually coming to their senses, I decided to take a risk. I stopped, put my hands to my mouth and shouted with all my might, calm down, covering the retreat. I got behind a tree and fired a line from my automatic rifle, without aiming, in the direction from where the noise of the chase was heard. Immediately beside me were the commissar, both of our adjutants and the chief of staff. The adjutants we sent back. Both of them understood perfectly well what I was trying to do, what I was counting on. Literally, in a few seconds, began to hear the voice of Tsvetkov, furiously shouting that the commander with the commissar and chief of staff shot back alone, that they were abandoned, that... I think there is no need to say in what style all this was carried out. It is clear, perhaps, that Vasya was not using perfumed epithets at all. In the meantime, letting the pursuers get closer, we hit them with 3 automatic rifles. Will our men return or not? Maybe I had put so much at stake in vain. The lives of my entire headquarters. How long can the 3 of us hold out? 5 minutes? Suddenly a partisan machine gun crackled nearby. Then another one. Another, they're back. The rest was easy. Order was restored as quickly as it was broken. The squads engaged in battle, and it didn't take long to end it with our victory. The advancing soldiers were scattered by a few flanking blows, went up in a counterattack, and the enemy fled. But this lesson I remembered for the rest of my life. September 19. The regiment went to the area of Radilovsky Lake and met with the brigade of A.V. German, V. Herman's brigade. Its numbers were small at that time. Our regiment, coming out of the partisan region, had more. However, this ratio was to change. Below I will tell you why. The camp of the brigade was set up in a beautiful and clean pine forest, about 15-20 kilometers from Struga Krasnaya, west of the villages of Sapirino and Kashino. We lived in good, dry and clean dugouts. The territory was kept in exemplary order, and all this very much resembled a military camp meeting in peacetime. The camp had such a good and quiet look that it seemed as if it was not in the enemy rear, as if no danger could threaten people here. I had met Alexander Viktorovich German before, in the partisan region, but these meetings were so fleeting that the time of our real acquaintance, I still consider the middle of September 42nd year, and the place, just described forest partisan camp. Much has been written about Herman. A rare book about Leningrad partisans does not contain a mention of this man, who lived a short but surprisingly bright life, who left a deep trace in the memory of those who happened to fight beside him. Herman's name is immortalized. It is worn by pioneer groups, detachments of Red Pathfinders. It was assigned after the death of the brigade to his brigade. One of the streets of Leningrad was named after him. And yet, despite the widespread popularity of Alexander Viktorovich, I consider it my duty to add my memories to the numerous stories about him. We had been in more than one battle together. We met both behind enemy lines and in the Soviet rear, and I saw him off from Valdai on his last raid, and the pistol from which he fired the last bullet in his life was a gift from me. A sad detail. It would have been better not to have it at all. We got together very quickly, from the very first meeting, from the very first evening we spent together, talking about what was of most concern at that time, about the fate of the partisan region. Our opinions were not identical in everything. We evaluated some particulars differently, but this did not hinder mutual understanding, did not disturb, but only, in my opinion, strengthened the quickly emerged feeling of mutual sympathy. Now it is difficult for me to remember what qualities of Alexander Viktorovich I paid attention to on that distant day. I could not know then, for example, what Herman was like in battle. I had to be near the bullets. I had to see with my own eyes his courage, his coolness, his ability to take risks when necessary and emerge victorious, his ability to lead the fight, always to hold the initiative, to make unexpected decisions leading to victory. This, I repeat, I learned later, but from the very first meeting with Alexander Viktorovich anyone could see him as a man of firm, strong-willed, decisive. He was direct, but not harsh in dealing with people, did not tolerate rudeness, hated rudeness and insolence. He did not tolerate sycophants, did not recognize dogmas, was constantly in search of new forms and methods of guerrilla warfare. And by his appearance he left only a good impression on everyone. Slender, always fit, alert, confident in his movements, courageous. I am not afraid to say that Herman was handsome. This word can rarely be used to characterize a man, but in this case it is difficult for me to do without it. And Alexander Viktorovich was handsome not only outwardly. He lived beautifully, fought beautifully. So he remained in my memory forever. By the way, I consider the photo of Herman passing from one book to another, not the... That evening we talked about the battles against the 4th Punitive Expedition. Herman was the most active supporter of the use by our units only such tactics, only those forms and methods of struggle, which could be called purely partisan, and in this it was difficult not to agree with him. However, I began to argue hotly, seeing that Herman condemns Vasilev for his use in battles with the Punishers and the tactics of positional combat. I said that purely partisan tactics can be presented in this case roughly as follows: not to prevent the Punishers in capturing the territory of the region, while at the same time striking at the enemy. For partisans, the fact of owning large territories is not so important in itself. Rather, it is even burdensome. Because the occupied territory must be guarded, it is much easier not to do it. There is plenty of room to live in any almost forest. Attack garrisons from there, sabotage railroads, maneuver, and leave the struggle for territory to the regular army. But all this would be true under one condition. The partisan region as it was in nature should not exist. But it did exist. There were peaceful inhabitants of the region. There was a relationship between them and the guerrillas, and it became our sacred duty in this connection to protect these people and this land by all available means. And in such a case we had to act, and not only with partisan methods. We argued for a long time, and I managed to convince Herman of something, but, I repeat, all this did not lead to dislike. Unfortunately, that evening we did not only theorize. There was also a practical part of the conversation, and I wrote the words unfortunately for this reason. The fact is that, as I have already said, our regiment also included a temporarily attached detachment of Hudyakov from Herman's brigade, numbering 1,500 men. And now it was time to say goodbye to this detachment. Sedov's detachment remained in the neighborhood of Bogov. Sweating ahead, I will say that communication with him was cut off, and we never met until we reached the Soviet rear. There were only 120 men left in the regiment, one detachment and staff. The regiment had never been such a midget before. However, many brigades, regiments, and detachments had in those days amazingly small numbers. There were persistent battles. Our units were melting before our eyes. The 1st Special Partisan Brigade, for example, in October consisted of 136 men, the 3rd Brigade, of 228. Well, how could you resist the transfer of Detachment Kudyakov? It seemed that Herman's brigade was firmly established in the area. The forest camp was convenient, and at first sight quite safe. Radio communication with the Soviet rear was maintained, and the most necessary things were delivered from there to the brigade by air. A day or so after our arrival at the agreed place, at a signal from the ground, a heavy bomber dropped at night a cargo, mostly weapons and ammunition. The same plane dropped a parachutist, an operative of the Speed, F.I. Katakigov, who had a special assignment. And yet the impression of a strong position of the brigade in this area was deceptive. I was immediately warned about it by Herman, and the whole situation spoke about it, if you looked at it more closely. The Punishers were always on the prowl in the forests, and then one or the other partisan group ran into them, and it was not always possible to evade the fight, although the skirmishes for us at that time were completely undesirable. Sooner or later the Nazis had to discover our camp. Is it necessary to say that in this case we would have to leave the settled places? We have too little strength to resist. But nevertheless, both Herman's brigade and our regiment did not cease fighting. Groups of bombers went out to the railroads and highways and ambushed them. Let not be as effective as from the territory of the partisan region, but we still struck at the enemy. 10 days passed like that, and on September 28 at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, first on the distant and then on the near approaches to the forest camp, there was a firefight which quickly grew into a solid battle. We were discovered and attacked by a large unit of Punishers, who apparently had sufficient experience in fighting partisans. The attack was conducted boldly, confidently. The Nazis were not afraid of the forest, as it often happened in other cases. In short, there was a threat of heavy losses on our part. It made no sense for a shabby brigade and no less shabby regiment to fight, defending the camp. One way or another, the Nazis would occupy it. We would only deplete our units. It was decided to start a withdrawal towards Radilovsko Lake. So began our wanderings, which lasted then more than a month. The first days we marched together with the brigade. Then we decided to split up and continue to act apart. Herman thought that it was inexpedient to stay in the areas north of the Pskov-Dano railroad. He decided to move to the south, to study the situation in those places, to try to replenish the brigade's units, which were disastrously thinning day by day, and later to decide how to proceed. He advised me to do the same. It was the right decision, and I did not object. If some of the readers are surprised by the fact that we separated, thereby significantly reducing our already small forces, let me remind you that we were different units, had different tasks, and our meeting did not mean joining. The regiment was once again in the swamps near the village of Lesnanica. Almost every day we lost people in short skirmishes. The regiment literally melted before our eyes. And now the record in the Journal of Combat Operations that in some skirmish killed one guerrilla meant a tangible damage to us. It became difficult to get food, people were starving, but even in these conditions, the regiment did not stop attacking the enemy. The same Journal of Combat Operations contains records that on October 5 we sent 3 sabotage groups to the railroad Skov-Porkov and Puff-Plusser, that on October 7 3 more groups went on a mission, that 4 more groups under the command of Titov and Nikitin acted on enemy communications from an earlier time. And all this bore fruit. On October 11, Rudakov's group let an echelon of 7 passenger cars, 3 platforms with equipment and 4 covered freight cars fall under the railroad Skov-Porkov. On the night of October 15, Obedkov's group blew up an echelon of manpower and equipment between Trigorsha and Rosha. In short, the regiment was not just looking for new areas for basing it at. We went farther and farther south. I persistently searched for a suitable place for basing, and everywhere we met units of Punishers and police, though not as active and numerous as in the area of Stroga-Krasness, but they posed a greater and greater threat to us every day. The regiment was fading away. It was no longer capable of serious resistance. After all, there were less than 100 of us left. We had to maneuver, evade skirmishes, move further and further south. And on top of all the troubles in one of the skirmishes, the radio was completely out of order, and we lost contact with the Soviet rear. Our situation was also difficult because we could not conduct the replenishment of our ranks, which was now strictly necessary, without risking to lose everything. After all, constantly nomadic, we did not have close contact with the local population, and therefore could not be sure that among those who want to go to the partisans will not be a traitor. And such a person, even if only one, in the current conditions and with our meagre numbers, could very easily become the cause of death of the entire regiment. In short, the situation was becoming critical. On the one hand, to accept the replenishment is necessary, and there was no time to think. Every day we were becoming fewer and fewer. The threat of the regiment's death had become a clearly tangible reality. But we were still moving south, still looking for a suitable area, still arranging diversions, and we still found the places we could get a grip on. However, we could not use them then, simply because by that time the regiment was only called a regiment. We were left with only 66 men, and a good half of them were sick and wounded. The only correct decision was to withdraw to the Soviet rear. But, looking ahead, I will say that we returned to the then scouted areas very quickly. The revived 1st Regiment soon launched active combat operations there. In the meantime, from the Rugodev Forest, located in the southern part of the Sudomskaya upland, we moved first to the south and then to the east, to the front line. I remember this day very well. Stepanov's group went out on a mission, and we, already 59 men, moved to the Novoshev-Sashevo highway. Stepanov was to catch up with us near the village of Kudaver. We were getting farther and farther away from the place where our comrades were soon to start the battle, and from time to time one of us or the other looked back, hoping to see at least some sign from there. And then far to the northeast to our left and a little behind us, there arose the glow of a fire which very soon became a great blaze. We were passing at that time along the elevation and could therefore perfectly see the blaze of the distant fire, which flashed brightly in the blackness of the October night. So, we succeeded. Unfortunately, I learned about the operation and its exact results not at the village of Kudaver, but only in the Soviet rear. The group caught up with us only behind the front line. Having taken off the sentries, they set fire to the warehouses and further, as it was planned, they shot from machine guns and automatic rifles the Hitlerites' unit guarding the warehouse. But then the Germans pulled up forces, organized a search. Stepanov was forced to loop, went 10 kilometers to the north, and when he brought the group to the designated meeting place, we were no longer there. The thing is that we were discovered by a police or gendarme detachment, and we, shooting back, withdrew to the east, and before Stepanov's appointed time. It was November. It was cold, and our shoes and clothes were worn out to the limit. In general, we had a terrible appearance. Ragged, dirty, overgrown, tired. After all, for 2 months we had fought over 350 kilometers through swamps, forest trails, off-road and mud, often under heavy rain, waist-deep in wet grass. And this, measuring on the map in straight segments. And in fact, we often looped, and all the way with weapons, ammunition, duffel bags, in a word, in full battle dress. And a partisan, who has no rear, but is always in the harshest front conditions, has nothing with him. Suffice it to say that no soldier of the regular army has probably never carried as many cartridges as we do. Where to take them, but in his own duffel bag. I remember that we came to a forest stream. It was not wide, 15 to 20 meters, but deep. We could hardly find a ford. In order not to dry our clothes on the other bank, we stripped naked. Then we put all our gear on our heads and went into the water. But what kind of water? After all, frost had already become a common phenomenon, and the water was up to our necks. That's when we felt how much we were carrying, having got used to it, and almost not noticing the heaviness. It turned out that it was impossible to carry everything to the other shore at once. We walked in icy water twice. And then there was another crossing, only this time we had to build a raft, and the logs for it were prepared from fallen trees, not with saws, not with axes. Where could we get them? But Finnish knives. We experienced a lot on this way. Cold and hunger and fatigue and incredible fatigue, and illness, and the pain of losing comrades, and the longing of complete detachment from their own. But still the regiment remained a fighting unit. We returned to the Soviet rear not broken men, but just infinitely tired. And literally in a day or two everyone thought about how to get to the enemy as soon as possible, how to fight with him again. We reached our own on November 6, and on December 13 the regiment again crossed the front line, only in the opposite direction, and it was already called the First Separate. Our rest in Valdai was not long. Literally the day after our return, I was summoned to the task force of the Leningrad headquarters of the partisan movement on the northwestern front. The group was headed by a party worker, deputy head of the military department of the regional committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, Vasily Porfiryevich Gordon. He told me in detail about the fate of the 2nd Partisan Brigade, the headquarters of which, together with the remnants of the 3rd and 5th Regiments, went to the Soviet rear on September 22. The 2nd Regiment crossed the front line in mid-October. In addition to our regiment, the 4th Regiment managed to escape from the ring of encirclement to new areas, to the Pozorovitsky district and part of the 5th Regiment, to the Donovsky district. The units in the Soviet rear are now being reformed, and soon the 2nd Brigade, which has replenished its forces, will go behind the front line again. Gordon also told me about the raid of Herman's brigade, which, like us, had gone south and parallel to our route, only a little to the west. I also learned about the fate of the 1st Special Brigade, the 4th Brigade and other partisan units. All of them were at this time in difficult conditions and could not yet firmly establish themselves in the areas designated by the Leningrad partisan headquarters. The situation was thus extremely difficult. Listening to Gordon, I did not doubt for a moment the future fate of my regiment. It seemed to me that after replenishment we would be offered to go to the village of Marevo to join our brigade, which was now there, and since the area of action of the 2nd LPB remained the same, I was firmly convinced that I would soon find myself again in the partisan region. However, this time I was wrong. When we talked about the fate of the regiment, Vasilev Porfirevich unexpectedly said to me, "He in Termdingrid headquarters suggests creating a new brigade on the basis of your regiment. How do you feel about it?" Frankly speaking, such a turn of affairs was unexpected. To create a brigade on the basis of a normal regiment, that's all right, but our regiment could be called normal only by a very thoughtless person. After the wounded and sick were in hospitals, in fact, only one headquarters was left in service. In such a situation, it would be good to revive a regiment, but here was a brigade. On the other hand, I understood, of course, the relativity of names. Above were given some figures characterizing the number of brigades of that time. It was often less than the number of our regiment. And this situation, by the way, was connected not only with the battles for the partisan region, during which we suffered very heavy losses. In later times, the brigades also had sometimes disastrously small numbers. The 1st Special Brigade, for example, in the spring of 1943, had in its ranks only 50 men. So the very name brigade in this regard does not seem to say anything. It is unlikely that the regiment will be formed with a smaller number of men. The only thing that remains is the independence of action. I repeat, not ready for such a conversation. And the main thing, for some reason I felt sorry for my regiment. It turned out that it had to cease to exist. And all of us, both the remaining soldiers and commanders, loved our regiment. All of us were not devoid of ambition and wanted our regiment to enter the history of the guerrilla movement. Maybe someone will see a logic in this. I will not argue, now I see it myself. But at that time I zealously defended the right of the regiment to keep its name. I don't think that Vasily Porfirievich was penetrated by my ideas, which, as far as I remember, were expressed in a rather confused form. Apart from the words, "It's not about the name," I probably can't remember any of my arguments now, but in the end he shrugged his shoulders and said that he would think about it, consult with Nikitin, and then we would continue the conversation. And the next day I already read a radiogram from Leningrad, the meaning of which was as follows. Our regiment is renamed the 1st Separate Regiment, thus it becomes independently operating. 10 days for formation. The area of combat operations and the date of departure to the German rear will be specified after agreement. I'm in command of the regiment. Now all that was left was to say yes, and carry out the order. So among the partisan formations and units operating in the Leningrad region appeared a separate regiment, the first and only one. The fever of staffing and preparation for the departure to the enemy rear began. The composition of the regiment headquarters has not undergone almost no changes. But among the commanders, commissars and chiefs of staff of detachments, was quite a lot of people with whom neither I, nor Kazakov, nor Stepanov had not met before. And there was almost no time for acquaintance. Suffice it to say that by the end of November the formation of the regiment was largely completed, but we left the German rear on the 6th. When the time came to discuss possible areas of basing, I was prepared for a conversation with Gordon much better than the first time. I had a firm and well-founded opinion on the matter, not just emotions, and I defended it. Vasily Porfirevich proposed an area in the forests west of Porkhov, which, judging by the map, was not much inferior to partisan Krai, but I, having just passed from Struga Krasny to Sushevo and beyond, knew very well that this impression was deceptive, and so I asked permission to settle in the areas adjacent to Novorshev, Pushkinsky, Gory and Soshikan. But there are no decent forests there. Gordon was surprised. "So what?" I said. "It doesn't embarrass me." "And where will you be stationed?" "In the villages, Vasily Porfirevich. It's possible there, I know. I've seen Many years later, a generalization will be made. The peculiarity and complexity of the struggle in the southwestern part of the region was that many of its areas were unforested. This created great difficulties for the actions of guerrilla units, and even more so for their basing. In all major population centers, the enemy kept strong garrisons. But at the same time, the total concentration of enemy troops in the southwestern part of the region was much less than in the central western, as well as in its southeastern areas. With the skill and experience of the commanders, this opened up the possibility for wide maneuvering actions of the partisans. This is a correct characterization, however, the words the opportunity for broad maneuvering actions in those days. When Gordon and I discussed the question of basing the regiment, with certainty was too early to say. We needed proof that this opportunity exists. I was sure of it. Gordon was doubtful. The last word was left to the Leningrad headquarters. The main tasks assigned to the regiment were sabotage work on enemy communications and reconnaissance. This, however, did not exclude possible raids on enemy garrisons, did not exclude direct fighting against punitive units, which Hitlerites, of course, would send against us. Proceeding from all this, we strived to equip the units with a sufficient number of firearms. In the selection of personnel, we tried to find good subversive specialists, experienced scouts. There were a lot of people willing to fight behind enemy lines, so we had the opportunity to choose. This was done by everyone in the headquarters, myself and Kazakov and Stepanov. Preference was given, of course, to those fighters and commanders who already had partisan experience. Finally, the regiment is fully staffed. It now consists of 4 detachments and a platoon of regimental reconnaissance. Numerical composition, 310 people, among whom 66 communists and 98 Komsomol members. We were well armed. 15 machine guns, 163 automatic rifles, 132 rifles, 3 mortars, radios, in each detachment. When the Northwestern Front's task force discussed the issue of arming the regiment, there was a proposal to provide all the personnel with automatic rifles. However, I flatly refused. And here's why. Automatic rifles are good only when there is an opportunity to freely replenish the stock of ammunition. And this, unfortunately, was not always available to us. What, for example, to do if the weather was bad, or if the regiment gets away from its base for a long time, or in case of a long pursuit by the enemy. Besides, in inexperienced hands, a machine gun turns into a real disaster. It is capable of devouring in a few minutes so much ammunition that even with a regular supply there is not always enough of it. I knew from experience that unarmed soldiers, having received a machine gun, use up ammunition as a rule, instantly, and then remain virtually unarmed. And there were men in the regiment who had never smelled gunpowder. The rifle is much better in this respect. It is not only more economical, but also much more long-range than an automatic rifle. It is easier to hit the target. Here it is necessary to remind that automatic rifles, which were in service of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War, had in fact the exact name submachine gun, PPD Dutyarev submachine gun, PPS Pagin submachine gun. And it meant nothing more than an indication of the small barrel length, in fact pistol length. By the way, the cartridges for submachine guns were also pistol cartridges. Hence, the range and accuracy were not as good as that of the rifle. All this, taken together, made us not very fond of automatic rifles. I have already written about the fact that the command of the regiment remained largely unchanged, added only the head of the special department of GNA Pietkin and the commander of the intelligence platoon, Lieutenant Lazarev. In the headquarters of the detachments, there were many new people. The first detachment was commanded by F.A. Alexeyev. His commissar was V.W.M. Molin, Chief of Staff, and Tarkalov. In the second detachment are respectively V.N. Andrei V.A. I. Popov, Z.A. Larinov. In the third E.P.A. Klimov Sai Pavlov, V.E.E.E. Vashchenko. The leadership of the fourth, sabotage detachment, was entrusted to hero of the Soviet Union MSS Karshin. All commanders, commissars, and chiefs of staff had a strong hardening and great partisan experience. They were proven in months-long battles comrades who had passed a difficult, full of surprises and hardships combat path. All of them fought in the partisan region, and this alone brought us together very much. The regiment was planning to cross the front line in the same area where we crossed it with Skarodumov's regiment in February 1942, on the way to Partisan Krai, between Stara Russa and Kom. This section, as the most favorable, the partisans used often. Here was a convoy with food for Leningraders. Here the front line was crossed by 3 detachments of Latvians, a detachment of Gorky Komsomol members K.E., Kotelnikov, a brigade of A. Herman, and many, many others. Here also on September 22, part of Vasilev's brigade went to the Soviet rear. Here also passed numerous partisan groups, dispersed by the Punishers. This, on the one hand, facilitated the transition, and on the other hand, complicated. The enemy could not fail to notice our frequent movement here, and therefore had to take countermeasures. But no matter how we assessed the situation on the section of the transition, but it was already determined, and the regiment had to go to the village of Kamenka and prepare for a rush into the enemy rear. Our way lay through an intermediate base established in the village of Marevo, about 150 kilometers from Valdai and 60 kilometers from the front line. Now there was Vasilev's brigade, which was to go to the German rear a week before us. Knowing about my desire to meet Vasilev and Orlov, Tuzikov offered me to entrust the transfer of the regiment to Marevo to the Commissar and Chief of Staff, and to fly there by airplane. Otherwise I would not find the brigade there. I gladly agreed. Tuzikov took me to the airfield in Vypolzovo. I was seated in the U-2. The plane took off, and then I did not even notice at what moment we left the ground. It went down smoothly, and everything left on it began to look like toys. Miniature, neat and very clean, as if fresh from the store. I looked around, holding my breath. The thing is that it was the first flight in my life, and I dreamed about it for a long time. Once, as a boy, having seen for the first time 3 airplanes flying, apparently, from Moscow to Petrograd, I firmly decided to become a pilot. And what boy did not dream about it then? In the first decades of this century, the dream of the captain's bridge was replaced by the dream of the pilot's cabin, and that was understandable. But just as before, when the captain's bridge was clearly less than those who wanted to become their masters, the realization of children's dreams was not destined for everyone. Mine, for example, did not come true. But from those very years until now, wherever I was and whatever I was doing, I tried to know as much as possible about aviation, about airplanes, about pilots, about everything new that was connected with the conquest of the boundless. And since my childhood I was pursued by an irresistible, strong desire to fly. Whenever I saw an airplane, it flared up with renewed vigor, and I, an adult man, desperately and boyishly envied not only the pilots, there is no need to talk about it, but even just the passengers. And now I am flying for the first time. I was already 35 then, and I had seen a lot of things in my life. I had been through the Second War after all, and this, you must agree, is no joke. And yet I still remember the feeling I experienced during a short, in general, flight on a U-2 from Vypolzovo to Marevo. It was an incomparable joy that filled me to the brim. Everyone who has ever flown on a U-2 knows that the wind could throw this light machine as it pleased. That day we had a decent amount of chatter, but I didn't pay attention to it. I was enjoying the flight. And so when the plane, having made a circle, went to land, it seemed to me that we flew not 150 kilometers, but 10 times less. I was walking through a quiet and surprisingly sparsely populated village, looking for the brigade headquarters. I was about to ask someone for directions, but suddenly I saw Orlov knocking on the window of a hut, smiling happily and making intricate gestures with his hands. I rushed to the porch and ran into Sergei Alexeyevich, who ran out to meet me. We hugged each other and we went into the hut. Orlov was alone and immediately began generously serving food on the table. I noticed an empty bottle of alcohol under his arm and wondered to myself, did he drink alone? He had never done that before. Meanwhile, Orlov had already poured the alcohol into glasses. We clinked glasses, drank to the meeting, and talked to each other for a long time about what had happened to us during the 3 months that had passed since the memorable night of September 7, when we said goodbye in the forest near Tatens, surrounded by Punishers. I noticed that in Orlov's stories there was some hidden resentment. Something depressed him, but he did not talk about it directly. Back in Valdai, I was somewhat surprised at the restraint with which they spoke about Vasilev and Orlov. It was unusual because their obvious merits had never been doubted before, and their authority was very strong. Not only in the brigade, but also in the headquarters of the Northwestern Front, in the operative group of the Elspede. Now something had changed. And it was not that the partisan region ceased to exist. The inequality of forces in the fight for it was visible to all, To blame Vasilev and Orlov has nothing to blame, and the decision to redeploy brigades and regiments to other areas was authorized by the Leningrad headquarters of the guerrilla movement. Then what's the matter? Nobody spoke about it directly, but one could understand that some people considered the brigade commander's departure to the Soviet rear to be completely unreasonable and therefore almost criminal. I remember I decided then that all this was idle chatter, gossip, and nothing more. But when I met Orlov, I saw that it was not so simple. In any case, the bottle of alcohol on his table was clearly a sign of some kind of trouble. Having learned that Vasilev had settled down in one of the neighboring houses, I hurried to him. Kombrig, Pomnachstaba, Ryabov, and 2 or 3 other people from the brigade headquarters were discussing some details of the upcoming tomorrow's march. Seeing me, Nikolai Grigorievich stood up impulsively, stepped towards me, hugged me tightly, and stood for a long time without loosening his arms. He was as glad to meet me as I was. He asked me to wait a few minutes, and when everyone had gone, we made ourselves comfortable and talked until morning. Vasilev would not even hear of going to bed, though he had a long journey ahead of him at dawn. He looked very unwell. I had heard that the brig was not well, but I had no idea that I would find him so ill. Nikolai Grigorievich was often coughing, breathing hard. His eyes were inflamed and glittered in the light of the kerosene lamp painfully and, it seemed to me, anxiously, though there was no anxiety. This can be said with absolute certainty. Vasilev himself was evidently not troubled. He had gotten used to his illness, considered himself healthy, and this cough, fever, troubled sleep. Nothing. It would soon pass. And I can't go to hospitals now, he said. In another time maybe, and would go to the doctors. But now I cannot. Everything has turned out so stupidly that I can't even scream. And he told me about how the remnants of the brigade tried to gain a foothold in the region, how they were blocked by the Punishers in the swamp, how hunger crept up imperceptibly, and how the decision came about the inevitability of a temporary withdrawal to the Soviet rear. All right, we would have stayed in the swamp. But what to do there? All the villages in the area were burned down, the inhabitants were taken away, the Germans were everywhere. There's nothing to eat, clothes are frayed, it's cold, people are sick. The Punishers chased us like hares. They were always on our tail. How much war can you fight like that? If we had killed people, it would have been the end. They had a radio. Vasilev requested permission to go to the Soviet rear. It was denied. Apparently, the task force couldn't believe things were so bad. Then a few more days of wandering. Then the batteries to the radio went dead and there was no communication. And then Vasilev decided to go across the front line to his own, against the and you know what they told me in Valdai. Here already in the voice of the commander clearly sounded resentment. They reminded me about the 227th Order of the Supreme. What porcupines. For everyone, they say, not a step backward. And you, they say, are an exception. As if we were an army unit in defense. He became agitated and paced around the room, gesticulating and heated as if it were not I who was sitting in front of him, but someone else who was accusing him of cowardice, who himself did not understand the elementary things, but took to judging and would not listen to any evidence. I had never seen Vasilev like that before. In a word, I realized that the brig was now led by a strong resentment. I must say that by this time changed the leadership of the guerrilla movement in the strip of the northwestern front. Alexei Nikitovich Asmolov, former head of the partisan department at the political department of the front, was appointed to a higher position and left Valdai. Later in a book of his memoirs, he wrote, "They say that someone from the new staffers, who did not know Vasilev well, asked, 'Is it true that the brigade which you commanded, disintegrated, ceased to exist?' The brigade is active. Its detachments beat the enemy near Pskov and Karamayshev. Some of the partisans who came with me are also ready to go on the campaign. So you're ready to lead the brigade back to the rear of the enemy? Ready to answer it and so on. That, in fact, is the whole story. Vasilev was ill, and, as we learned later, fatally. He shouldn't have gone behind the lines, of course, but it seemed to him that if he turned to the doctors now, he would never be able to prove that it was not weakness of spirit, not fear that made him break the order and take the rest of the brigade to the Soviet rear. Anna Smolov writes, in late November 1942, the brigade crossed the front line and went to the former place of action, in the Sobolovsky forest. Again full of hardships, partisan life, again almost non-stop fighting. No sooner had the brigade set foot on the land of the former partisan region, as the Nazis met it with a punitive expedition. The partisans repelled the enemy's attack, but, given his multiple superiority, Vasilev decided to withdraw the brigade from the Didovichi district to Novoshevsky. The disease of the brigade quickly progressed, recalls in an essay about the brigade commander-in-chief Vasilev, former partisan journalist of Vinogradov. What only measures did not take paramedic Nina Romanovna Shebakova? Nothing helped. Vasilev was getting worse and worse. "You're completely sick," Orlov persuaded him. "Nonsense. Everything will pass." Vasilev continued to give orders, although at times his voice dropped to a whisper. There was only one way out: immediately take the brigade commander by airplane to the Soviet rear. But, as luck would have it, everything was covered by a blizzard. Partisans did not have a suitable site to take the airplane. The ice on the lake was thin. There was no flat clearing either. Nikolai Grigorievich was losing his last strength. During transitions, he was carried on a stretcher. On December 11, an alarming radiogram was sent to Valdai. "Vasilev is seriously ill. Immediately send an airplane to Lake Susilitsa. Radiate the departure of the plane." In a serious condition, with sharp shortness of breath, the commander was taken to the Bolshaya Zemlya and put in the hospital. On March 26, 1943, Nikolai Grigorievich died of transient pulmonary tuberculosis. We crossed the front line about a week later than Vasilev's brigade, and almost in the same area. Several days and nights regimental reconnaissance, carefully studied the situation in the area of the village of Kamenka, and finally on December 12, south of her secretly concentrated the regiment. We waited for nightfall. For me it was the ninth crossing of the front line, a matter, it would seem, not new. But I was preparing for it very carefully, without discounting the existing experience. Yes, and they should never be made, because even under the most favorable circumstances and even in areas where there are almost no enemy troops, this operation carries a deadly danger. If the enemy detects the regiment in its frontline rear, he will always be able to pull up enough forces to destroy us. That is why the scouts literally probed for several days every inch of the section of the crossing. At 23 o'clock, all units took their initial positions, and at that time, either having detected our movement or shooting at random for fun, Hitlerites covered us with artillery fire. The shelling was short and did not cause any harm, but it worried us. I knew that both north and south of Kamenka there were other suitable areas, and still decided to go here. If we were really discovered, I thought, the enemy would almost certainly think that we would not operate in the place where the artillery attack had taken place. I knew that in recent months no one, including Army scouts, had ever crossed the front line later than 1 o'clock in the morning. I decided to start moving at 4, in the pre-morning hours. The anxiety of night weariness inevitably fades, does its job, and the physical need for sleep, which, if the surroundings are quiet, literally rolls off your feet. And how strong the pre-morning sleep is, I think, everyone knows. Maybe the German observers will be dozing. Having once again discussed with the commander of the military unit occupying positions near Kamenka the details of possible interaction, they mainly concerned the support of us with artillery and machine gun fire in case of detection by the enemy. Exactly at 4 gave the command to start moving. Low black clouds, almost no visibility. A group of scouts was moving ahead, laying 3 parallel tracks. In the head of the main column was Stepanov, closer to the middle, I further, Kazakov, and in the rear guard, Alexeyev with a group of miners. Stepping aside, I listened. Only a muffled rustle, reminiscent of the sound of quiet wind in the treetops, came from the track. People were focused, cautious. The recent artillery attack had forced everyone to pull themselves together, to discard unnecessary pressure. So far, so good. Let's just pass without shots. There are 2 German pillboxes on our right and left, between them 300 meters, and the pillboxes are not visible now, but we are in the zone of fire. I wish they hadn't noticed. Like shadows, slowly and silently slip and slide 3 endless chains of partisans. Quiet all around. Quiet. Finally, about 7 o'clock in the morning, having mined the trail crumpled by 300 skiers, we went deep into the Odisky bogs. There on wooded islands we could find a shelter for a day's rest and, if necessary, also convenient positions for defense. At dawn the enemy will surely find our trail and rush in pursuit. So, the only task now is to get as far away as possible, and there is not much time for that. The daylight in December, though quite late after 9 o'clock, but now it is already 7. We moved without breaks. It was hard to walk. During the night, the frost changed to thaw. The snow became wet and loose. It stuck on skis, making it difficult to move. It was hardest of all for the scouts who laid the track and for the farm workers who carried all our explosives on special sleds. Still, we were lucky. When the dawn came, we found that we were moving in a thick fog, which was then replaced by a fine and tedious rain, falling from the dense clouds overhanging the treetops. So there was no fear of enemy planes. I decided to take advantage of this, and we continued to move in the daytime. We had to hurry up and that behind, in the direction from where we came. There were several characteristic explosions. Apparently, our mines were blown up by the Hitlerites who came on the trail. However, we became more and more difficult. People were tired. We had to take breaks more and more often. In addition, the rain brought with it another completely unexpected unpleasantness. It turned out that many people had received half-coats made of poorly made sheepskin. Having gotten wet in the rain, they began to stretch out in length, and after a while there were quite a number of absolutely comical figures in the column. The floors to the ground, sleeves below the knees, both sad and funny, and what to expect from these fur coats when they dry. By the end of the day, the weather had improved a little. It stopped raining. We went 30 kilometers deeper into the marshes and finally settled down for a long rest. In the darkness, it became noticeable that the sky above the area of our crossing the front line was illuminated by continuously launched rockets. Probably, the enemy mistook us for a large military group that had come to his rear and now feared a simultaneous attack from both sides. So we don't have to fear pursuit, and we had gone quite far away. The next day in the morning there were clouds in the sky again. Fine rain was falling, and we, not being afraid of an attack from the air, made a big crossing and came to the western edge of the Radyski bogs. By evening the horizon in the northwest was clear of clouds, the temperature began to drop rapidly, and it started to freeze. Very quickly the wet snow turned into ice, our coats turned into ice shells, and our felt boots into real pads. There was a danger of freezing people. The only way out was to build fires. It was risky. We did not know the current location of the enemy garrisons, but there was no other way out. In a small forest between the villages of Keshvalutina and Glotova we took a rest, and immediately dozens of fires were lit in the forest. Simultaneously, in all surrounding settlements were sent out groups of scouts. Fortunately, there were no Hitler's garrisons in the nearest district, and we spent this night quietly. All of us were able to dry off, warm up and sleep, so that the morning we set off cheerfully. However, if the enemy was nearby, he would hardly dare to attack, and here's why. When it dawned, I moved away from our camp about 200 meters away, and noticed that the smoke of the fires, rising up and intertwining with each other, formed such a monstrous column, looking at which one could assume that in the forest is not a regiment, but a hook. And what forces could the enemy garrisons have if they were nearby? In such circumstances, the Nazis always preferred not to hurry. They first pulled up large forces, creating numerical superiority, and only then entered the battle. And one more thing. When the regiment moved on the road, I again stepped aside and listened. 300 pairs of skis were scraping the hard ice, making such sounds that one could think of anything, even of a powerful column of equipment of a completely unknown type moving through the forest. However, all this was only speculation, and it was good that in the end they remained speculation. This day I led the regiment to the very village of Zeleny Klin, where my headquarters was located in the summer. I wanted to go to one of the hiding places I had already written about, to get half-coats to replace the ones that had fallen into disrepair. The places are familiar to the smallest details. It seems that every path, every forest track welcomes us like relatives. Surprisingly quickly a man becomes attached to the land he defended, on which he endured hardship and pain, on which he himself found shelter and protection. In one's home and walls help. I have noticed that our nomadic life has accustomed everyone to see a home under any tree, as long as its branches were able to shelter from wind and rain. And here is a strange thing. The tree under which you spent the night seems so much your own in the morning that it is almost as sad to leave its crown as it is to leave the house under the roof of which you have lived for a long time. We were walking along the land that had become native to everyone who had already been here. We marched through forests, through swamps, through villages where we used to know every house. It was a sad march. Almost all the villages on our way were abandoned. And what kind of villages were they? Ashes, burnt stovepipes sticking out here and there, trees blackened by fire. and somewhere there were dogs, not understanding where people had gone, but waiting for them, continuing their usual and nobody-needed business, to guard. Guard what? From whom? The village of Zeleny Klin was also gone. But the cache on the edge of the swamp survived. No one had come to it before us. By opening it, we were able to replace coats and boots for everyone who needed them. Those who had broken their skis on the trip were given new ones. And since there was almost no food left in the duffel bags by this time, we filled them with perfectly preserved grain, just in case we took away almost all the ammunition stored in the cache. As I've already said, any of us was especially greedy for them. We moved on, and when it began to get dark, we heard the familiar sound of a U-2 labourer waddling from somewhere to the front line. A few hours later in the woods near the Vitebsk railroad, I learned that this plane had taken the seriously ill Vasilev to the Soviet rear. I learned about it from the very same Sarychev, who had once been my deputy on the economic part, and now held this position in the headquarters of the 2nd Brigade. Together with a group of scouts who were tasked to search for our regiment, he came to me with a note from Orlov. Sergei Alexeyevich suggested that I change my route, join the brigade and take command of it. But how could I agree to this without instructions from Leningrad or Valda? So I wrote back that I consider it a supreme honor to take command of the brigade, and if there is an order from Nikitin or Gordin, I will follow it with pleasure. In the meantime, I continue to go to the specified area. I never met Orlov again, and I do not know what he was guided by when he sent me that note. Some time later, Nikolai Alexandrovich Rachkov, former commander of the 3rd Regiment, took command of the brigade. Along the Vitebsk Railroad, Hitlerites located in the villages quite a dense network of their garrisons, so it became unsafe to move further in a general column. It was decided to go to the target by detachment. The regimental staff marched with the 2nd Detachment, commanded by Andreev. At night we crossed the railroad and, having moved a little away from it, settled down to rest in the village of Prigon, for the first time in many days in warm village huts. Nearby, in Chikachevo and Sorokin, are large enemy garrisons, to Chikachevo 5.5 kilometers, to Sorokin's 4. We put up reinforced barriers, warned people that a battle was possible, that we should be in full readiness. The morning was foggy again, as after crossing the front line, visibility was no more than 100 meters. It was impossible not to use such weather, so taking into account that the men had already had some rest, I gave the command to get ready for them. And at this time, apparently having found our trace at the railroad, and having gone on it to the village, we were attacked by a division of Hitlerites. They lay down in the cemetery, located on the hill in front of the village, and opened machine gun fire. However, in the ensuing firefight, we smoked them out of their convenient positions quite quickly and drove them towards Chikachevo. But we got wounded, 3, and all of them badly. Besides, almost certainly the soldiers from the garrison in Sorokin were already rushing to the shots, and we must now prepare to repel the attack from the other side. In about 20 minutes our barrier was shot almost at point-blank range by a detachment of 40 policemen coming from Sorokino. Now we had to leave. We forced march to the north and, having passed 5-7 kilometers, crossed the Bezhenitsy-Purkov highway. Here we were overtaken by a group pursuing Hitlerites who attacked from the side of Chikachevo. Our people chased the fascists for 2 kilometers and killed 15 people. At the cemetery from which the Germans attacked us, 7 more dead were found. So together with those 40 who were shot on the way from Sorokin, we have 62. When we crossed the highway, the fog began to clear, and visibility soon became normal. From the direction of Bezhenitsy on the road moved a few vans which, having noticed our column, stopped in the distance and watched our movement. I ordered to move to the northwest, not as previously planned. Once out of the observation area, we returned to our desired course. Now before us lay the hills of the Sodomskaya upland, familiar from our autumn wanderings. 2 days later, at dawn, we went to the designated area for the collection and temporary basing of the regiment, in the Rugodevsky forest. The reconnaissance platoon on trophy horses, which were captured in the battle near Sorokino, all the way along the Sodomskaya upland promptly provided us with reliable information, so we moved quickly and without adventures. We reached the goal before the other detachments. Horses appeared, by the way, both in the regimental headquarters and in Andreev's detachment. Without them, we could hardly have reached the goal so soon. Having entered the Rugodevsky forest, We thoroughly examined it and chose an excellent place for the organization of a temporary camp. On the top of the highest hill in the forest, the steep slopes of which were densely overgrown with trees and bushes, there was an observation point. The whole neighborhood could be seen from it as well as possible. With binoculars, even separate houses of Nikulino, Viber, Veska, and other villages were perfectly visible. In the south, the Sorat River was winding its way to Vybor, where there was a large enemy garrison, in a straight line 10 kilometers, to Veska, where the township government was located, US 7 to Nikulino 3. All the roads, now covered with a thick layer of snow, were in plain sight. Only one of them, leading to Vybor from Rusaki Junction on the section of the railroad between Skov and Opochka, has been cleared. In short, we could not have wished for a better observation point. At the foot of the hill, on a wide flat hill, the camp was placed. This hill also had rather steep slopes, which made it extremely favorable for a defensive battle. The only exception was the approach from the southeast, which was quite gentle. In the forest, overgrown with centuries-old pines and spruces, were quickly built good huts, reliably hiding the men and the light of the fires from observation from the air. The days of waiting for the approach of the other detachments of the regiment dragged on. Would Alexeyev, Klimov, and Karchenko be able to avoid collision with the enemy on the march? Will they reach without losses? The area of combat operations of the regiment, defined by the Leningrad headquarters of the guerrilla movement, looked like this. It was limited to the sections of the railroad Pskov, Ostrov from the west, Pskov, Dio from the north, and Dino Soshevo from the southern border passed through the settlements of Ashevo, Novoshev, Pushkinsky, Gori. Thus, we had to operate on the territory of 4 districts of the Leningrad and Kalinin regions. The railroads passing through here were actively used by Hitlerites for bringing manpower, equipment, and ammunition to the front, as well as for sending the wounded to the rear and exporting looted valuables to Germany. The traffic on the section Skov, Ostrov was especially lively. Southwestern districts of the Leningrad region in the winter of 1942-43 became the place of extremely wide and active actions of partisans. Next to us, a little to the north, A.V. Herman's brigade settled down. The 2nd Brigade and several separate detachments were later redeployed here, together with our regiment. The total number of partisan forces in the southwest amounted to about 1,500 people. That is, 3/4 of all partisan forces of the region, which at that time had a connection with the Leningrad headquarters. For successful subversive work of the regiment on enemy communications, it was necessary to identify the system of road protection, the placement of German garrisons, the order of patrolling during the day and night, the rate of daily movement of trains. Therefore, the first days we were engaged only in reconnaissance. At the same time, we had to think about creating an agent network. This was handled by the operative group headed by Georgy Ivanovich Payatkin. For work in Pskov, Ashevo, Ostrov, Novoshev, Porkov, and other settlements, people were selected. Legends were developed for them. On the basis of our possibilities and conditions in this or that place, methods of work were determined. Ways were sought to place our people in German institutions, and especially in railroad stations. This recruitment of those already working for the Nazis began. Measures were taken against attempts of the enemy to throw their agents to us. The future showed that it was not unnecessary at all. Klimov's and Alexeyev's detachments had to wait for a short time. Both of them made quite successful marches. Skirmishes with the enemy were avoided. They had no losses. And for Karchenko's detachment, I was the least worried, although it separated from the general column before the others. The custom to wandering away from the main forces, extremely experienced, repeatedly tested in difficult operations. Not without reason, the largest number of decorated orders and medals was in this unit. And suddenly a radiogram. Karchenko died. In the collection Unconquered Land of Pskov is the text of the political report of the commissar of our regiment, Alexander Ivanovich Kazakov, to the Leningrad headquarters of the partisan movement. In it, Kazakov reported on details of Karchenko's death. December 12, 1942. After crossing the railroad Dino-Nokiao between D.D. Shubin and Yamuk, heroically died commander of the 4th Detachment M. Karchenko with soldiers Krasnonos K.E.S. Ivanov I. and Nurse Yolkina 3, K. at dawn the railroad. After a while were seen riding on the road to Shubino Germans. The detachment lay low and the commander with soldiers Krasnonos K. S.I. Ivanov, E.F., and Yolkina 3, crossing the road on which the Germans were traveling continued to move soon in the direction of the village Yarmouk, where went M. Karchenko, heard machine gun fire. The sent reconnaissance did not find the commander of the detachment. According to information received from residents of the village Kashino, Vasilev and Svetlov, it became known that the hero of the Soviet Union with 3 soldiers between the villages of Shubino and Yarmouk fought with numerically superior enemy forces and was killed in this battle. The enemy abused the dead, stripped them naked. They are buried on the height, which is 1.5 kilometers southwest of Shubino, by local residents. At that time there was no one among partisans who did not know Misha personally, or at least had not heard about him. One of the first in the partisan region awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. He was a living legend. Songs were sung about him. There were many stories about his amazing bravery, and his sociability was legendary. He knew everybody and everybody knew him. Many months later, the partisans of our regiment will be killed by a policeman, from whose hands they will take out a personalized automatic rifle, presented to the hero of the Soviet Union MSS Karchenko by the workers of Leningrad, so it will be known that Misha fought his last battle with a detachment of polizei. His murderer did not escape retribution. The new year has come, 1943. While waiting for the approach of Karchenko's detachment, we stayed in the Rugodev forest, taking all measures not to be detected. The camp was left only by scouts, loggers, and individual sabotage groups, which were strictly defined places for leaving and entering the forest. This, and the fact that they operated at a considerable distance from the camp, should have ensured its safety. And yet, observing the movement of the Hitlerites around the area, we could assume that they had got wind of some. With suspicious consistency, they visited one after another all the villages in a row, asking the inhabitants about something for a long time, and our scouts told us that among the population of the villages there was a rumor about a large landing of the Red Army, landed somewhere nearby. So we should be even more careful. Thanks to the successful actions of scouts, we quickly accumulated the necessary information about the situation in the area of deployment of the regiment, realizing the importance of the Ostrov-Kharkov railway line. The enemy organized its increased security. Garrisons of 50 to 200 men were stationed at the railroad stations and in nearby settlements. The largest of them, armed with automatic guns, mortars, armored cars and tankers, were located in the villages of Lopatino, Solovy, Delovka, Korovy Selo and others. The Ostrov-Porkov highway, which crossed our district from southwest to northeast, was guarded in the same way. Mixed garrisons, consisting of polizei and German soldiers, were located in Slavkovichi, Lutsibolity, Kayuchika, Shmolovo, Verkhny Most. On the highway Ostrov-Novolshev there were also garrisons in the settlements of Shiki, Malshevitsi, Skiratov, Sobolitsy and others. Hitlerites' measures to protect communications were not limited, of course, to the placement of garrisons. The road sections passing through forests were protected by strips 100 to 150 meters wide, cleared from the forest and mined in the most dangerous places. On the railroads there was around-the-clock patrolling. Threatening the death penalty, the Nazis demanded from the population of the villages adjacent to the roads to immediately inform the authorities about the appearance of partisans. It has already been mentioned above that the area of our military operations was characterized by the absence of large forests, and we assumed the basing of the regiment mainly in villages. And this required the establishment of the closest connection with the local population. Without it, as experience has shown, a successful guerrilla war is unthinkable. Gradually we began to conduct political work in the villages. Our people told about the situation at the fronts and in the Soviet rear, about our struggle behind enemy lines, agreed to provide the partisans with as much help as possible. We also began preparations to receive airplanes from the Big Land. In 15-20 kilometers from the base was chosen area, which went to a special well-armed group. It was tasked to find a place suitable for landing airplanes. The first attempt to take the cargo, which was to be dropped to us on parachutes, we made at night on January 3. But it was unsuccessful. An hour before the arrival of the planes began such a snowfall that they circled over the drop site and did not see the lighted fires, had to return without accomplishing the task. Soon, however, the weather improved and things went well, and then a primitive, but quite suitable for U-2 landing strip was prepared, and the supply of the regiment was set up brilliantly. We began to receive everything we needed, down to newspapers and letters. Having settled down in the new place, we began to prepare the first major operation. A raid on the garrison in the village of Vybor, after which we were going to change the place of deployment. We decided to carry out the operation immediately after the arrival of the sabotage detachment. More and more often I went up to the observation post and spent hours looking through binoculars at what was happening in Vybor. I drew up the necessary scheme for battle management, calculated the possible variants of attack. I had no doubts about the success of the operation. I noticed, however, that on one of the days in the garrison arrived replenishment. This made me a little suspicious. Whether Hitlerites are not going to attack us before we attack, I ordered to strengthen the surveillance. The weather these days became so bad that it was pointless to keep a group of receiving planes at our airfield. Called her back to the regiment. Finally, on January 16, at about 6 in the morning, a sabotage detachment appeared. But not joy brought his arrival, and the strongest anxiety. The fact is that our saboteurs had not taken any precautions, having obtained somewhere on the way a whole toboggan wagon, without any disguise. They moved openly, almost with songs, to the place of meeting with us. They drove as dashingly into Niculino, waking up literally all the villagers. Having refreshed themselves with food and some with moonshine, they went straight to the Rugadevsky forest along the only road leading only in our direction. No one even thought about the fact that the Germans could easily come to the camp on their trail. And in the meantime, that's exactly what happened. We didn't even have time to reprimand those fools for their carelessness. From the observation post, a liaison came running and reported that 250 Hitlerites came to Niculino on carts. Not even half an hour passed, as followed a new message. The enemy appeared in the village of Kakalevo. From the side of Novoshev, a detachment of up to 150 men came here. It became clear that the enemy was preparing for battle. It is unlikely that he expects to meet the regiment in the forest. Most likely, Hitlerites expect to block and suppress only the detachment that has just arrived and made so much noise. But the clash still cannot be avoided. We decided to take the defense, hold out until dark, and then break out of the encirclement, in which we will inevitably be taken, and go to a new area. About 9 o'clock, Hitlerites finished preparations for the attack, and having surrounded the camp, began to probe our defences. Soon on all directions there was a persistent firefight. Taking into account that there was a whole day ahead, I ordered to save ammunition, to fire from automatic rifles only single shots and only in exceptional cases, short bursts, machine gun and mortar fire only on enemy clusters. It was felt that Hitlerites could not determine our numbers. Several times they tried to carry out a flank maneuver, a rear approach, but everywhere they met retaliatory strikes that brought them tangible damage. Our positions were so good that during the first 2 hours of the battle we had no losses, and this despite the fact that the intensity of enemy fire was constantly increasing. The attackers called for reinforcements. But here came a report that the Hitlerites managed to somewhat squeeze Alexiev's detachment. In the zone between new positions of the detachment and the enemy, the commander of the group, Melnikov, was wounded in the stomach and in the left hand. The Germans tried to capture him, but Melnikov desperately shot back with a machine gun. Two partisans also tried to get to him. They wanted to help him to get out from under fire, but without success. Together with Tetkov, I went to Alexiev's detachment. We moved away from the headquarters only 30 to 40 meters, and at that time I felt a strong blow on the shin of my right leg and heard a deafening explosion. Not yet realizing what had happened, I looked back and saw Tvetkov slowly settling into the snow and my horse whipped up on a tether by a tree 30 meters away. A mine, fired by the enemy most likely at random, exploded about a meter to my right and behind me, and 3 or 4 meters in front of Setkov, who was following me. Never, neither in the Finnish war, nor in this war, has never left me the certainty that neither a bullet nor a piece of shrapnel can touch me. I don't know how to explain this confidence, but it was so great, so strong in so many battles, that even when I saw my own blood, I thought that it was Vasia's blood. Not feeling the pain yet, I rushed to him. He was lying motionless, and from his neck a red rivulet was pulsating, staining the snow pink, thickening before my eyes to dark scarlet. His pants at the knee were darkened with a large, rapidly blurring stain. Svetkov was very pale, but conscious. People came running up. Vasia was carried to the hut which housed our infirmary, and only then I felt pain and saw that my right Valenok swelled with blood. Stepanov was nearby. Someone helped him to lead me after Setkov. I can still clearly see my horse. Its chest was covered with blood, and the right front leg, broken by a shrapnel, was hanging on a piece of skin. I managed to order to shoot it, and at the sanitary unit's hut, some fuss. Why? Here I noticed that my clothes on me torn by shrapnel, from it sticking out wisps of absorbent cotton, so you can assume that I was pierced 20 times. Zetkov's wound was serious. A large piece of shrapnel damaged the bone just below the knee joint, and the second one, miraculously not tearing the carotid artery, passed close to it, leaving a large laceration in the neck. 4 others were wounded by the explosion of this mine, about 20 meters away from Vasya and me. One of the partisans was sitting in a trench at that time, with his hands on the berm. His fingers were torn off. In short, everyone suffered much more than me, despite the fact that I was much closer to the mine. Only 2 pieces of shrapnel. One penetrated the Achilles tendon, slightly damaged the heel bone, and the other entered the 13 muscle below the knee joint. After dressing, I returned to the command post. I found out that Melnikov had managed to get out from under fire after all. He had run out of ammunition and was fighting off the fascists with grenades. Now he is receiving medical aid. The fight went on until dark. Then the Germans withdrew. In our infirmary, 9 wounded. We decided to leave the encirclement, by the way, which was used by the loggers and airplane reception group, further to go first to the south, to the bank of the Soroti, then up its stream to the east, and then to the north, to the area of the village of Se, on the lake located not far from it. We expected to receive airplanes with ammunition, and on the return flight to send the wounded to the Soviet rear. There was only one dangerous section on our way. We had to pass very close to a small village occupied by the Punishers. They were waiting here for the night in order to attack our camp again in the morning. We had enough forces to destroy the Hitlerites in the village by night raid, but I decided to try to pass unnoticed. Let them think that we stayed in the forest. This would give us time to break away from the inevitable pursuit. We were again lucky with the weather. For the 3rd time after crossing the front line, all night long minimizing visibility and covering our tracks, it was snowing in large flakes. In such weather one could pass under the Germans' noses even during the day. The regiment, which had a large number of horses and sleds, moved forward easily and quickly. Having moved away from the Rugodevsky forest to a quite safe distance during the night, we settled down for the day in a large village. Everything was going well, and only the aching pain in my leg, which increased with every hour, spoiled. In the village for the first time after leaving Marevo, we had an opportunity to wash in a bathhouse. There was a reinforced combat guard, so there was no need to fear a surprise attack. Smoke was smoking above the village bathhouses. One must have been in our skin to realize what a joy it was, a bathhouse. However, I do not wish joy at such a cost to anyone. Through deprivation you can instill a love for the most insignificant things, but why should you? One can often hear elderly people reproach young people. We, they say, went to war in tattered cotton coats, and now you want some jeans, and not all of them. I do not share this point of view. Everything is right. We had to wear such cotton jackets during the war, but not to stay in them. Our joy from that village bathhouse is not a reason for appeasement and not an edifying lesson. It is just a small touch to the portrait of war, a phenomenon ridiculous, unnatural, and if it gives some semblance of pleasure, then in the same ridiculous and unnatural way. However, nobody thought about it at that time. We enjoyed the bath, but for me it became a torment. My leg ached incredibly, and I could not return to the hut on my own. At dawn, when we arrived in the village, the owner of the hut, an old man of about 80 years old, taciturn, and not very friendly in appearance, went into the cold summer half of the house and was mastering something there. I thought that he was just continuing his work, which had been interrupted by our arrival. Turns out he wasn't. Noticing my limp, he'd gone to make me crutches, and now, smiling, he knocked them on the floor, as if to demonstrate the strength of the product of his hands. Here, son, you'll feel better. And many such old men each of us met during the war, and the boys, our dear boys, who literally clung to the partisans, and women and old women, whose husbands and sons fought to the death with the enemy far from home. There was a saying among the people back then, if you help them, they'll help you. Old men, women, children, everyone helped us in any way they could. They helped us with food, helped us with clothes, linen, hid and treated the wounded, gave us valuable intelligence information. And somewhere far away other people did the same for their relatives, and altogether it meant the concept of people's war. Semyon Efimovich Lenikov, a paramedic of the farm Grishanovo, was shot by the occupants for hiding and treating wounded partisans, giving shelter to our scouts and liaisons. The peasant Vasily Dmitrovich Koltakov, knowing perfectly well that he was risking his life, collected food, shoes, and clothes for us. For us, food, shoes, and clothes. Sheltered the partisans in a difficult moment, learned what he could about the enemy. He too was shot by the fascists. 65-year-old Igor Pavlov led out of the village Ostrovki of Novoshevsky district, surrounded by Hitlerites, a large partisan detachment, and helped it to hide in the forest. There are hundreds of such examples. Is it possible to forget the courage of these people? Is it possible to forget the severe fate that befell them? Is it possible not to leave a place in the heart for eternal gratitude to them, for any help? A piece of bread, a pair of underwear, information about the enemy, a place to sleep in a hut by a hot stove, a pair of crutches for a wounded man. From the very dawn, from the side of Rugodevsko forest came the sounds of machine gun fire, deafening bursts of mines, cannon shots. Hitlerites were storming the camp left by us. The battle with an empty place lasted for several hours. Apparently fearing new human losses, the Punishers decided to plough the whole area with deadly iron before the attack, and in a couple of days from the captured by our scouts German soldier and policeman, we learned that Hitlerites reported to their command about the destruction of a large partisan unit in the Rugodev forest. If we calculate, according to the reports of the Punishers, how many times they destroyed our units and what number they had, we would probably get a figure exceeding the total number of partisans who fought several times.